launches in Zoom just doesn't cut it for me, because you really need to interact with not only the poet and the author, but also amongst guests. And amongst you today, I see friends from the Singlet community, authors, people from church, friends who are just friends, and hopefully new friends too. One of the questions that someone asked me just now was, how did I get to publish John or Jonathan? I guess he was this random young person in church that I'm sort of aware of. And then I started reading his things in Singri Pomo, and suddenly the two dots sort of connected. And after a while, I thought to myself, Jonathan Chan is well worth publishing. Because most importantly, I think his works communicate. And it's communicating in a very honest, in a very real and personal way. But beyond the personal approach, I think what he writes about is very universal. Our experiences may be different from his, but the themes that he writes about is relevant to all of us. I'm very proud to publish Jonathan. I don't publish many poets. And I like to believe that, I shouldn't say this, okay, I will say it and then I will apologize. Maybe I should apologize first before saying it. So I apologize to all the other poets here that are not published by me. But I like to believe I publish the best poets. So I see Siok nodding very sagely in agreement. No. I think there is a place for many more publishers who publish poetry. And all of us will find different voices that together tells the nature of Singapore through poetry. I guess growing up, everyone in their teens or I don't call them pre-teens these days, call them tweens these days. You always try to write poetry of some kind, and it was an expression of how you were feeling, and more than that, how you wanted people to know you were feeling. And whether or not you showed anyone else the scribblings you did is irrelevant, because you were expressing the deepest things about yourself. And Jonathan has done the same. He's written very personally. He's written very deeply about himself and his family, but he's able to share these works with us because I think he has the maturity to do so, to be able to go beyond the shell of a teenager or a tween and stand up as a poet. So I present to you Jonathan Chan, the poet.
Well, thank you to Eck Kheng for that very kind introduction. I'm elated, delighted to have so many friends, family, familiar faces here for this launch this afternoon. I'm very grateful that all of you have set aside time this Saturday to come and be with us all of here today. I'm indebted to friends, family, editors, mentors, and of course, Eck Kheng. We've seen iterations of the manuscript that would become this book over many years. And I'd like to begin by reading the collection's first poem, 5 Foundings, which in many ways is illustrative of what I hope to achieve with this book. So, 5 Foundings. He who goes out weeping bearing the seed for sowing, shall come home with shouts of joy, bringing his sheaves with him. Psalm 126, verse 6, from the English Standard Version. So, 14:18. There are quiet miracles along this river. Words are beginning to take shape. The stars are beginning to realign. Letters will nourish the soil. But these circular walls will not always hold. Roaring currents will stir under silk folds, and the roots of this tree will dig not only deep, but wide. Canton to Kuala Lumpur, 1900. These drunks come bearing open hands and barren tongues, taking to textures of penciled reports and dusted tracks. Home takes the shape of new mouthfuls and the tingle of belacan. The cool of oil palms and humid gospel halls, but unspoken murmurs cannot stay ignored for long. Over waters they came, and over waters they will go. Seoul to Hong Kong, 1969. There is refuge amidst towering green hills. The trails cross from peninsula to port, bereft of visions of squalid cells. There are echoes in local print and communal lyrics. The cacophony of this home has a neon gleam. For theirs is a world of disco lights and wonton mee, bayside walks and the foamy sea, heels clutched from anxious feet. Kuala Lumpur to Houston, 1981. They say these streets were paved with aspiration. The ranches are far from our cul-de-sac. At church, the piece shows who arrived first. Dusty staircases nestle an ornamental clock. The angklung rests beside the piano and the swords above the organ. Turkey bones salt the chuk, and the stuffing is full of lapchang. These are burritos, not popiah, skewers, not satay, but at least our names can remain the same. New York to Singapore, 1997. Marriage was an Episcopal church in a concrete borough, imagined in faded photos on a living room cupboard. In traded cityscapes emerge questions of what it means to taste perennial unease. For there is no continuity in sweat-stained uniforms and red-scratched booklets and stripe-smeared faces. Automated welcomes ring hollow. But the newscasters who bow, and the billowing smoke, and the whispers good night, let me know that I'm home. Thank you. So the poet Liang Li once made the following comment on his autobiographical writing. He said, "I know I need to get beyond my personal history to hear a greater impersonal voice, an anonymous voice, and I really wanted to hear that voice, and I knew that one of the ways I would be able to do that is to get past the personal history, and the only way I could do that is to write it." And the poet Christian Wyman once remarked that every poet has his or her particular obsessions. For him, it was the question of God. And as I've thought back to the questions that have most preoccupied me in my writing, I found that I've continually returned to the question of what it means to be at home in a place and what that entails, especially when so much of that has felt predetermined or shaped for me by my family's history. Five Founding stands as a kind of mythicized account of 5 times that my extended family has established itself in a new country or city. My ancestors establishing themselves in pre-modern Korea, my ancestors moving from southern China to Malaya at the turn of the 20th century, my maternal grandfather moving his family from Seoul to Hong Kong in the 60s, my paternal grandfather moving his family from Kuala Lumpur to Houston, Texas in the 1980s, and finally, my own parents moving to Singapore from New York City in 1997. It is a kind of poem that is unabashedly autobiographical, but one that would not necessarily work without being laden by some of these contextual questions. The poet Basil Bunting has said that a poem should be able to stand on its own by virtue of its sounds and images. And the complications of my past that have shaped my writing have often led me back to the impulse to explain and to contextualize, especially because this question of home has proven so onerous for me. In fact, it only really became clear to me that this question of home and what it means to be at home was a central organizing theme and metaphor for this collection when prompted by Eck Kheng. The question he posed to me was, what do you want to say through this collection? The force of clarity behind Eck Kheng's question prompted me to sit down and think about what held all these poems together, especially because this manuscript began as an assemblage of poems I'd written intermittently over the years. And my conclusion was that as a prevailing message, the notion that home is amorphous, complex, and studded with varying points of weight and familiarity is probably what is most pronounced, and it is my hope that those who read it, hopefully many of you here, will be invited to consider these questions of belonging for yourselves. What is home? Where is home? Where has home been for our families, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on? Because especially when we think about Singapore, we think about that kind of distance from the place that perhaps many of our ancestors were from or came from. It becomes a much more interesting question than I think most of us would give it credit for. So I recently gave an interview with Janelle Tan, a Brooklyn-based Singaporean poet, about this collection, and she noted that the next poem I'll be reading, Yellow Face, to her is the collection's anchor poem. I agree with her assessment in some respects, because this poem encapsulates more precisely some of the difficulties I felt in feeling at home in Singapore, despite my having been brought up here and my naturalization as a Singaporean citizen. So this is the poem Yellow Face. For those who have a copy, it's on page 57. Yellow Face. When I was 10, I shared an accent with my best friend. Flattened quasi-American syllables, he by way of Sweden from India, me the pressure of lucidity across Houston, Singapore, Seoul. We were estranged, not yet local, not wholly foreign, gravitating in constellations of starched white, navy blue. I once thought it was merely the stubbornness of the tongue, breaking the illusion of a yellow face streaked in green. The questions that followed: why you slang? Where you learn Chinese? The furrowed brows. I stopped trying, settled with unease, and withdrew to strum guitars, reggae by hazy midnight and rocky mountaintops. I learned how to sing for Hari Raya. Kwame says a multiracial nation ignores its multiracial children to its peril. In the office, our English glides, articulate, Mandarin sheathed until further notice. Never mind that we look closer to Punjabi, Korean, Kristang. Sikhs are the other, he says, eyes welcoming us into the tightest of social compacts, curiously absent from special silos. By the crunch of bosam, wrapped in lettuce and slathered with gochujang, we feel the edges of the only English we seem to know best. The tang of crushed lemon filters the soju. Were you the only Korean in your class, your level, your unit? How far down will these roots dig? The faces turn, masking our shame from the elders at the table. I have been back for 2 months and have swallowed the tonic of an online divide. It seems simple. We do not make costumes of our friends. I forget I do not inhabit this country's skin, not just yet. It is one thing to be asked where you're from in Britain, and another to be asked the same question within weeks in the place that will always, almost feel like home. Thank you. So this poem, Yellow Face, was provoked by the controversy several years ago about an incidence of brown face in a local advertisement for an e-payment service. The rappers Pretty and Subhas Nair released a rap that exploded with righteous outrage about the persistence of such forms of racist representation in Singapore. And the irony was that their targeting of Chinese Singaporeans as culpable for such misrepresentations led to their censure and arrest at the hands of the police. Now, what was striking to me was the questions that this whole controversy yielded about who gets to belong in Singapore, who gets to be seen as central to how Singapore envisions itself, and how I, as a person of East Asian descent and appearance, get to pass as part of Singapore's majority, at least until I open my mouth usually. And the idea of wearing yellow face was that I would never have to experience the kinds of indignities that other minority groups in Singapore face, despite my own feelings of alienation and exclusion I experienced growing up here. And in a way, I don't think I'll ever feel completely accepted in Singaporean society. But the conclusion I've come to over the years is that I may never feel fully reconciled to any set of specific cultural or national surroundings, and that there will always be some point of differentiation that I can continue to insist on, should I choose to. It is this recognition that I will always be at ease with unease in some sense that has proven most restorative. This is especially so as I've come to see that as a strength when reaching out to those in groups who might have felt left out for one reason or another, or as I've come to see each tie to a place as an opportunity to draw a connection with those who have known and loved these places that I have. It is also this turn in the book, this poem, that marks a turn in the book, as it figures as a transition from attention to my family and familial history to attention to my own relationship with Singapore. And this poem that draws the book into the fold of moral, environmental, and religious concerns. And to me, the ultimate feeling of home has arisen from the stabilizing force of my faith and belief in God as a Christian, around which all these other cultural national fragments have found a point of anchorage. A very tangential side note, my friend who shares those quasi-American syllables in his manner of speech, who came here from India via Sweden, is seated in the audience today. So thank you for letting me include a bit of your story in the book. So it is with that I would like to close with two poems, the collection's eponymous poem, Going Home, and the closing poem, Epistle. So Going Home, I did my prep, it's actually on page 42 of the collection. So Going Home, Singapore. I run in the enfolding of sunset. Street lamps burst into electric luminosity, just as pink seeps through the cracks of cloud cover. The darkness does not overcome the light, though it envelops the cradling of hope. Absence yields the breath of possibility, however long the stretch of dusk. The streets begin to hollow, craters filled, drains cleared, and craftsmen ferried home. My feet carry me into the evening. Each room's sliver of light goes off. The auntie's video chats at the sharp corner of our staircase, the blue blade beneath my father's room, and the rush of my own vanishing bulbs. Away in Tuas, shrouded in the dark by towels draped on metal frames, brothers pray by the glow of smartphone screens. And so do I. Thanks. So that's Going Home. The next poem, Epistle, can be found on page 84. Epistle. Of wisdom, splendid columns of light, waking sweet foreheads, I know nothing. Who was weeping? Why? Li Yang Li, Epistle. I write a letter. I write a letter to the faithful scattered over sea and air. I write a letter to those who swallow the taste of their prayers. I write a letter to those who know it is easier to forget. I write a letter to the stomachs that hold bitter gravel. I write a letter to the mouths bloodied at the corner. I write a letter. I write a letter to every unknowable thing. I write a letter to the sensations that can never be named. I write a letter to the loosest form of faith. I write a letter to the shuddering dusk of perception. I write a letter to the particles that dance in the light. I write a letter. I write a letter to the unhomed, the unhomely. I write a letter to feet evacuated from natural inscription. I write a letter to the soil whose old ways I can never know. I write a letter to the stories glazed over by concrete. I write a letter to lifeless, bulldozed sand. I write a letter. I write a letter to those who know God. I write a letter to those who don't know God. I write a letter to the creatures that God knows. I write a letter to God knows what creatures. I write a letter to creation and hope it forgives me. I write a letter. I write a letter to myself. I write a letter to my future self. I write a letter to the self I thought I knew. I write a letter to the self only God knows. I write a letter to the self that strains to know God. I write a letter. I write a letter to an invisible enemy. I write a letter to an invisible friend. I write a letter to the plans stubbed like smoke. I write a letter to plans. I write a letter. I write a letter to cosmic humor. I write a letter to cosmic love. I write a letter because cosmic love loves me. I write a letter. Thank you. So I want to say thank you to the so many of you who are sitting here who have sewn into this book, whether by your company, your mentorship, or your editorial scrutiny. That contributions may have been conscious or subconscious or even unconscious from many of you. For that, I am grateful. I hope that these poems encourage you to contemplate questions of truth, beauty, and justice, and that they encourage all of us to be more intentional and thoughtful as we consider our respective places in relation to time and space and to the communities we know to be home. Thank you very much.
We're going to move to a kind of question and answer. Give you some time to think about what you want to ask Jonathan. I do also want to say a little bit about the cover. When we discussed the cover, the idea that I had in mind was not so much home, but travel. So the streets, the clouds, or what you see on the cover, they're not clouds, they're contrails. So from airplanes, suggesting travel. And travel to different places which were and had become home for Jonathan and his family. But just now, when Jonathan read the title poem, Going Home, it struck me that the cover could well be an illustration of the poem. The imagery, the behind in the poem is very much what you see on the cover of the poem. So no, it wasn't intentional that way. It came to that in a very roundabout way. Okay, I've given you enough time to think. Any questions for Jonathan? If not, I have to be a teacher and going to seek out someone.
Was your process of selecting a title easy, and were there any other options that you were considering?
Thank you, Izzy, for that question. This was not the title of the manuscript that I worked on many years ago. It went through a variety of iterations. At one point, I was very interested in the organizing image of clay and clay being molded. So it was once called firmly wrought. Another time, I wanted to style myself as a very serious person, so it was 5 Foundings and Other Poems. Thankfully, moved away from that. And I think, as mentioned before, in my discussions with Eck Kheng and thinking about what really was the main idea, the main theme, the main metaphor for the book, that it came to home. And I'll admit, I Googled to see if there are lots of books that were called Going Home. Thankfully, there are not a lot. So if you Google it with my name, usually this is the only one that comes up. But basically, it was all still kind of centered around question of identity, question of place. But I'm pretty content that I'm pretty glad with the name of the poem that we ended up, the name of the poem that we ended up lending the book's, the collection's title to. Yeah.
Anybody else?
Hi, John. Some artists, they spend their whole body of work grappling with a single question. Artists like Christian Warren. Some artists take one body of work to grapple with one question and then they move on. Which do you think you're tending towards?
So it's an interesting thing that Christian Wyman also said, which is that he's suspicious of poets that hop around themes. If they don't have one particular obsession, then consumes them their entire lives. I don't know yet. I'll have to see if I can scrounge something from my brain for a next collection. But I think I'll probably be returning, or I don't know, fixated maybe on these ideas of home and place and travel, probably for a while, because as it is and as it remains, my family is still scattered. My own family, my nuclear family unit, we are the only people in Singapore. So by virtue of familial obligation, we'll still be going back to the US, we'll still be going to Korea. And I think maybe the way that I think about it will change or mature, and that might be reflected in the work. But I think I have a sense that I'll continue to be centered around this particular set of themes and ideas, or even the question of migration, actually. I've been thinking a lot about different kinds of migration that are not my own as well.
Hi, Jonathan. I have a technical question to ask you. The poem you read, Yellow Face, there is obviously some ellipses, right? There's a dot, dot, dot. And I don't think you have that for any other poem. So usually poets don't do that unless, I don't know what was the intention. And also the other question would be your choice of lowercase for the entire collection. It has to be deliberate, and was there an influence, something that include?
Thank you, Kai Chai. Lovely to meet you in person. Been a fan of your poetry for a while. With Yellowface, the choice of the ellipses in many ways is a way for me to represent the passage of time and temporality. So this idea that these are separate incidents that all kind of converge or come together, coalesce would be a better word, in one way or another, because these are all incidents that experience, culminating in the last stanza that's reflecting on the particular incident that drew me back to all these memories of feeling foreign or feeling out of place in Singapore. So it was a question of representing temporality more than anything else, I think. And there are all these ways that can be done, A, B, C, 1, 2, 3, in terms of making that demarcation between stanzas very clear. But I think what felt most organic was to have the ellipses in terms of representing the flow of time. In terms of the lowercase, it's something that friends have made fun of me over for many years. A lot of people see it as a way, or whether consciously or unconsciously, of me trying to imitate E.E. Cummings, but I think Cummings chose the lowercase for very different reasons. I think for me, especially with the case of the lowercase I think part of me wanted to withdraw, didn't want to draw so much attention to myself or the self of my speakers. And I think that carried on the rest of the poems. Part of it is also probably aesthetic or stylistic. Like I just had a preference for the uniformity for the letters of the page when they were not capitalized. But as I went back and revised, I figured that I should probably put some proper nouns with capital letters because, I think I have a poem in here that quotes William Shakespeare and I put his name all in lowercase, and the past editor was like, it irritates me when people do this. So I went back and, it's like, like place names, the names of people, family, I went and put those in capital letters because in a way, I was also showing a more proper sense of respect to these people who are featured in the poems themselves. But yeah, thank you for your questions.
Hi, Jonathan. I have one question, which is this collection, would you say it is a way of claiming your roots wherever they have been located through history into the present, or a way of making peace with the state of migration, which has been a necessary part of your life on account of having family relatives, and which will continue to be the state of how you live in the foreseeable decades to come?
Thank you for that question. And I'll also take the opportunity to introduce you to people. This is Leonora Liao, who's an accomplished writer of short stories who very kindly wrote a blurb at the beginning of the book and who's been a mentor to me over many years. With respect to the book, I would probably say that the process of writing poetry was part of that process of reconciliation for me personally. But I will also say that the way, or some of the ways in which I think about the book is as a kind of testament, perhaps, especially the first half that deals mainly with themes of family and family history. And I suppose, personally as well, that process of reconciliation within the self and that process of finding peace, it didn't necessarily come through the poetry, but the poetry was definitely one expression or avenue for that. And, I think I returned to poetry as a medium because I thought that it was best capable of providing space of trying to pull together all these disparate, sometimes contradictory elements. But as for the question of going forward, I like to think that maybe I'm like Liang Li, because Liang Li, similarly, his father was the personal physician to Mao Zedong, and they moved from China to Indonesia before they settled in the US. So for Liang Li, a lot of his poems were about his own family and all the history that came before him. And in the quote that I mentioned, there was that he said he had to write about before he could move to something else, which I don't know if he has entirely, maybe he has in his more recent work. So maybe that's part of the creative trajectory I might see myself going on. I don't have to write about just myself as intently and as intensely as I have in the past anymore.
Hi, Jonathan. Firstly, what would you say was your favorite poem to write and why?
That's a good question. Thanks, Seiran. Seiran is our wonderful guest who's come all the way to Singapore from London via Turkmenistan on the invitation of some of his family friends who are also our family friends. In terms of poem that I most enjoyed writing, or my favorite poem to write, is an interesting question. I don't know really, because I don't think of them as favorites, and they all kind of just, maybe there is a commonness to how I write them. I'll sit down, and if there's a particular idea or an image or a line that springs into something else. In terms of, maybe poems that are more fun to read, that maybe reflects that they're fun to write, I did like Habemos la Comida Cubana, which is all about a family friend in the audience who is of Cuban heritage, who used to make Cuban food for us here in Singapore. That's quite a fun poem. Maybe Epistle, the last poem, was something that I thought a lot about as a way of pulling together a lot of things I was mulling over and thinking about and were really weighing on me. And I ended up thinking about writing letters, with each letter being like a poem, to represent that act of writing as a way of addressing or giving attention to some of these concerns that I had. So, I don't know. I don't know if that makes it seem like poetry is not a very fun thing, fun activity. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe the people who do spoken word have more fun than me, I don't know.
Jonathan's dad put up his hand. So should I give you the mic?
I was waving at a friend at this
I know, I'm just joking.
Anybody else?
If not, I want to say a couple of thank yous. Thank you, Jonathan, for allowing me to publish your book. I want to thank Enabling Village for allowing us to use this space. For those of you who have never been here, there's so much to explore. There's a cafe further down there called Professor Braun. There's Art Faculty, a wonderful shop that sells Singapore souvenirs designed by people from this community. And many, many other places to explore here. I do encourage you to spend some time looking and wandering around this beautiful campus. Lastly, I want to thank Jonathan's parents for being here and supplying the beverages that you serve. Anything else left for me to say? But I suppose thank you all for coming.